Hello, it's Amy. I'm here with the next chapter of A London Book Window by James Milne. And today's chapter is titled Short Stories of Quality. Do you read short stories? Probably you do when you come across them in magazines, in weekly papers, and in daily papers, for they may now be found there. On the other hand, you probably turn away from a book of short stories. Has it ever occurred to you to ask why this should be? There is really no reason for it, except perhaps a little prejudice, which somehow is characteristic of English readers. One fancies that the long reign of the three-volume novel had something to do with the inability of the short story, almost for an equally long time, to find any great place in English literature. A whole generation was nourished on the three-volumer, as it was called in the late days of later Victorian writers, like Wilkie Collins, Anthony Trollope, William Clark Russell, and Blackmore, the author of Lorna Doone. How surprised those old novelists would be, even Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray, if they could look up and see the many books of short stories which appear today. Here is a list compiled with some care of perhaps the best present-time volumes of short stories. It is not implied that they will all appeal to all readers. Some will, some may not. Simply, I give the list as one of short stories that have had a real current success in book form. Where the Pavement Ends and in Dark Places by John Russell. Miss Bracegirdle and Other Stories, and The Love a Duck and Other Stories by Stacey Amunier. Short Shipments and Old Wine in New Bottles by Eleanor Mordaunt. The 4,000,000 and the Gentle Grafter by O. Henry. The Vrouw Grobler's Leading Cases and the Second-Class Passenger by Percival Gibbon. There's one of those instances where half the name is at the end of the line and the next is at the beginning of the line. Percival Gibbon. Tales of Mean Streets and Green Ginger by Arthur Morrison. Captures by John Galsworthy. To Tell You the Truth by Leonard Merrick. The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. The Pleasant Husband by Marjorie Bowen. Uncanny Tales by May Sinclair. Told at the Plume by Eden Philpotts. Men, Maids, and Mustard Pot by Gilbert Francow. These Charming People by Michael Arlen. It is not enough to make lists of the best books of short stories, and so one goes on to take this one as a text for where we English people are in regard to the short story. It does not stand so high with us as it does with the French, but you do not need to be told that if you know anything about French literature. Maupassant was a great writer of the short story, or, as it is called in French, the conte, which means, if one may so express it, a short story done with literary quality. Now that is what our short stories have rather lacked in the past. The English world of fiction was so essentially the long novel that men and women of writing talent gave little attention to anything else. They said to themselves, why should we trouble about a kind of art which does not seem to be native to English readers? It would be very beautiful to master it and to persuade English readers to read it. But that is to undertake a pilgrimage. As it is, there is an endless demand for long novels, and when one has succeeded with one of them, one is almost compelled to go on in that manner. You see, therefore, that the attitude of what one may call the old-fashioned English public towards the short story also determined the attitude of the authors toward it. It would be a curious person who deliberately set out to write something for which there was no likelihood of success, and it would be very discouraging. The consequence was that a quarter of a century ago, most of the English short stories written were really fragments of long stories, rather than the complete, beautiful little things which we associate not only with French authors like Maupassant, but with American writers like Edgar Allan Poe. He was one of the greatest masters there has been of the short story, which is distinct from the French, meaning a story of high drama as well as of literary distinction. It is scarcely too much to say that Edgar Allan Poe is the father of the American short story. And when that is said, it should be remembered that the American short story has, in recent years, greatly influenced the English short story. Bret Harte, who lived a good deal in this country and who died here, was also a master of the short story, as take to mention one gem among his writings, The Luck of Roaring Camp. He had done his best work when he came to England to settle, but there is no doubt that his presence among us did much to influence English writers interested in the craft and technique of the short story. What helped it from the first in America was the magazines like The Century, Scribner's, and Harper's. They all wanted fine work of this kind and were willing to pay well for it. Therefore, an American writer found it easier to place short stories than long stories, a reversal, you perceive, of the English situation. But when The Century and Scribner's and Harper's had a large sale, as they once had in this country, they drew upon English writers of ability. That circumstance gave a certain helpfulness to the eventual rise of the short story on our side of the Atlantic, for its position today is infinitely stronger than it was a quarter of a century ago. Will you please appreciate, then, that the two literatures of the world which have done most for the short story are those of France and America. But there is no reason why we should not do as much for it as they have done, and allowing for our fertility in authorship even more. One may say that with some assurance, because at last we really have reached a point where people, even ordinary readers, do take an interest in the short story when it appears in book form. And that is something like a small revolution. Not long ago it was nearly useless for a publisher's traveler to make an advance copy of a volume of short stories around the booksellers and hope to get a good subscription. He simply could not do it because the booksellers knew that their readers did not care for reading of this sort, and that therefore any example of it would most likely remain on the shelf. No bookseller likes to order literature which is going to meet with that fate, because every bookseller, if he is to succeed, must be a businessman as well as a man fond of books, if he always is that. He would tell you that the chief enemy, if one may put the things rather strongly, of short stories, was the Englishwoman who always said she could not be bothered with them. When one says that, one gets back to the influence which Victorian reading had upon Victorians, and it lasted until the younger people of our own generation began to think for themselves and to read for themselves. It was difficult, perhaps, to make a good short story out of a purely domestic situation, because character and even to a certain extent human problems have to come into it if it is to be a drama within a very limited space. With the long novel, you could wander about here and there and everywhere, and if the writer was interesting personally, it did not much matter whether his plot was well knit or not, whether his characters were really human people, or whether they were merely stock figures. No short story, however, could be written in that way, because the essence of it is that every word must tell, that there must be no superfluous word in it, and that it must go along rapidly from its beginning to its end. We have seen within our own experience how brilliantly English can be used for short story writing. The high master of it in our time has been Mr. Rudyard Kipling, and no doubt his plain tales from the hills did more to blaze a highway for it into our modern literature than any other event that has happened. Some of his stories appeared in Macmillan's magazine, which, like Longman's magazine, Blackwood's magazine, and other magazines, once issued from book publishing houses, took trouble to get good short stories because they had readers who liked such reading and could appreciate it. There was the other reader, he of the popular magazine, who did not want too good stories, and to whom Kipling's plain tales would have been overfine, the reader who only wanted something stirring. Now that has led to a kind of short story for which a French master of the art would rebuke us, something that is interesting enough to read in an ordinary way, but not artistic. Every magazine meant for popular circulation is filled with such stories, and they are quite good, very wholesome, and very well paid for. They are not, however, short stories of the caliber of Kipling, for his may ultimately rank even with those of Edgar Allan Poe. What has happened all round is that the purely popular tale has gone up in art, while the artistic tale, without coming down in quality, has gone into its own public. When Catherine Mansfield died, everybody said, "We have lost a writer of exquisite short stories." And so we did. We have still, fortunately, other writers not less good, and one thinks of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his Sherlock Holmes, or again of Mr. Percival Gibbons and his Mr. Stacy Amunier, whose extraordinary lightness of touch gives readability to everything he writes. There are still many English authors of fiction who content themselves with long novels, only now and then producing a volume of short stories, which are just chips from their workshops. But fortunately, we are creating a real school of short story writers, men and women, who place that difficult art, because the short story is extremely difficult to do, before the writing of novels. The change has come, for one reason, because there is today a much better short story market in England. That is the practical side of things, and indeed any editor of almost any magazine will tell you that he has real difficulty in getting enough good short stories. It is perfectly true, and so anybody who thinks of authorship might very well think of the short story, because it is a road which will lead to good fortune if the necessary literary abilities are present. It is much better for a young writer to be appearing with short stories in the magazines than to be toiling away for years at a long novel, which may never have a public at all. The short story is the paragraph of fiction, because it has to be shapely and complete in itself, not merely what we have called a fragment of a longer tale. Mr. Gilbert Franco, an admirable writer of short stories, always begins his long novels from the end and works backwards, as it were. He certainly could not do that with a short story, because it is necessary, before you start writing, to know what will happen all through. There is the beginning, the setting of the plot. There is the middle, the working of it out. And there is the climax, when the whole fruit of what has been written comes to a head. It will be asked, perhaps, if an English writer is likely, with short stories, ever to win the fame that Scott, Dickens, or Thackeray won with novels. Nobody can answer that, but it is certain that Kipling's short stories will keep his fame green when perhaps some of his long ones have been forgotten. Everybody cannot hope to be a Kipling, since that means genius, but at least he has shown what a wonderful literary field there is today for the right kind of recruit. Mr. John Galsworthy, a graver writer, has proved the same thing, and if after what has been said you still have the idea that short stories do not interest you, will you please get his captures and see if they are not compelling reading. We owe a good deal to Mr. Galsworthy, as well as to Mr. Kipling, to Mr. W. W. Jacobs, to Mr. Leonard Merrick, and to others, but the fact upon which we may entirely congratulate ourselves is that at last the short story in English literature is comparable artistically to the short story of America or France, and to say that is to give it very great praise. And so that is James Milne writing in 1925 on the English short story.